welcome to Regent and welcome to a special evening. It's great to see you all and fun to see everybody giving hugs and seeing one another, people that they haven't seen for a long time. Warmest welcome to many of our Rasha friends, Regent grads, some who've come from far away, and present students, as well as friends and neighbors, and those who are joining us online. Welcome to all of you who have responded to the invitation to learn about a place at the table. My name is Thina Ayres, and for many years it was my privilege to be on the faculty here at Regent. It was in the early 1990s here at Regent that I first met Peter and Miranda Harris, the co-founders of Arasha. Peter was an Anglican minister in Britain with a love for birds and a deep conviction about the need for Christians to focus on the pressing issues of conservation and environmental protection. It was these convictions which motivated Peter and his wife Miranda in the mid-1980s to start a field study center and bird observatory in Portugal. And this brought together many students, scientists, and people concerned about the environment. They banded birds, did research studies, interceded with government officials, and engaged in countless conversations over Miranda's delicious meals. What they were doing at Arasha, Portugal, resonated with all sorts of people. In a very short period of time, there were Christian field study centers in Britain, France, Lebanon, Kenya, and Canada. Today, they have a presence in 30 countries. Regent and Arasha have been closely linked over the years. In the mid-1990s, Peter and Miranda heard about Regent College and a Dr. Lauren Wilkinson who was teaching about environmental issues. After correspondence back and forth, Lauren invited Peter and Miranda to come to Regent College as missionaries in residence. They were a wonderful addition. And as a result, they came back often over the years to give various courses and lectures. And in addition, Arasha and Regent College worked together on various conferences connecting the gospel with creation care. Several of our Regent graduates have gone on to work at Arasha, and annually we share the leadership of the justly famous Gulf Island boat trip, and they teach a course on that boat trip entitled Technology, Wilderness, and Creation. In their teaching, the Harrises conveyed their content and their concerns with knowledge, experience, and passion. And they were a huge inspiration to our students. They spent time with students, individually and together, listening, encouraging, and motivating them to think deeply about God's world and their part in it. One of my vivid memories is standing with a group of their students one year just when they were leaving. So Peter and Miranda were coming down those stairs, and the students and I were standing at the top of them. We stood at the top of those stairs, waving goodbye, kind of sadly. And I looked around, and I discovered that I was not the only one with tears in my eyes. Their love and friendship impacted many. Thus, it was with shock and sadness that in October of 29, we learned of the tragic car accident in South Africa, which took the life of Miranda and their two colleagues, Suzanne and Chris Naylor. Arusha and Regent College hosted the live stream memorial service for Miranda, and we grieved together here in this chapel. It is out of that pain and loss that the book, A Place at the Table, took shape. And that brings us to the Harris's eldest daughter, Jo. Jo had visited the college with her parents, and after graduating from university in Britain, made the decision to come to Canada and study at Regent. It was a rich time of growth for her, and during the 4 years she was here, she met another student, Sean Swinney, who became her husband. Jo and Sean live in Bath in Britain, and they have two lovely daughters, Alexa and Karis. When she came, Jo was happily swept up into Regent's hospitality, and in her community group that met weekly to discuss the things that they were learning and to share life and prayer. These community groups were called soup groups because in the early years at Regent, this same Lorne Wilkinson, who I mentioned, and his wife Mary Ruth, made soup every Tuesday in great big pots and brought it in the back of their car into Regent College so that the whole student community could share a meal together. It is very fitting that Mary Ruth Wilkinson would be the one to write the introduction to this book we are launching this evening, A Place at the Table. This book is, in fact, the 8th book that Jo has written since leaving Regent College. That's quite an accomplishment. And having been a fan for many years, I can assure you that she writes with honesty, with significant Christian and theological maturity, and a truly great sense of humor. I recommend her books to you, and several are available in the bookstore, as is Peter's book, very delightful, a book about the beginnings of Arusha entitled Under the Bright Wings, and you'll see it out in the bookstore table. The format for this evening is that we will begin with a short film that will introduce the book. There will then be an interview with Jo and Peter and an opportunity afterwards for you people to be able to ask questions. Following this, we started a tiny bit late, and it's an informal kind of evening, but around 8:15 or so, we will stop the questions or whatever, and there will be a time of refreshments that will be right out here. Jo will do some book signing in the atrium. Our Arusha friends have set out a lovely table up there, and there will also be the opportunity to meet with Jo and Peter more personally. So let's begin with the film, please.
Arusha means the rock in Portuguese, and it's a charity that was founded in 1983 in Portugal. Right from the early days, community and hospitality and shared life and shared food were all very central to what was happening. And Arusha has grown around this value of hospitality and community, largely, I think, because of who my mum was. She could whip together a complicated meal in no time with hardly any ingredients, usually a lot of garlic and mustard. She did a lot of speaking and a lot of writing around the themes of community and hospitality and belonging, and talked for a really long time about writing a book on it. Lots of people asked her, when are you going to write this book? You really should be writing. I assumed, and I think pretty much everyone else did, that it wasn't probably going to happen. In October 2019, my parents were in South Africa with the A Rocha chief exec, Chris Naylor, and his wife, and they were on their way back to the airport to head home when there was a road accident coming over the bridge in Port Elizabeth, and the car went off the bridge, and Mum and Chris and Susanna were all killed instantly. In the following year, we realised that the house was just really quite a painful place. So we began to dismantle it slowly. And we had left Mum's study for last. We found this binder in which she had made a really good start on her book. We began to realise that she had done a huge amount of writing. It had an outline, it had the beginnings of about 6 chapters, all sorts of notes and quotes and thoughts. From that moment, really, from that day of sorting, I just was absolutely determined to get her book over the line and get her in print and get her words into the world. And what we have is a book that's very much co-written by both of us. It's our 2 voices talking about this gift of hospitality, the gift of receiving it, the gift of giving it, and what it has meant to the both of us, and what it has meant to A Rocha. There's great joy in a big gathering around a table, and the conversation and the laughter that happens. You're meeting a physical need of hunger, but you're also feeding people with what it's like to be part of something and be part of a gathering where you have a place, even in the clearing up and the mess of it all. It's a physical expression of love, really. Her writing was very much like her, beautiful and alive and vivid and enchanting.
Okay. See you soon.
I'm just absolutely over the moon and so proud of her that she's done it.
I'm glad now to welcome both Peter and Joe, and we're looking forward to hearing from both of you. And these are the lovely people who've come for the evening. Peter Harris and Joe Sweeney, here they are. I'm going to begin with you, Joe. A Place at the Table is a unique book in a variety of ways. Could you comment on the structure of the book and how it was written by both you and your mum.
Okay, first of all, I just can't believe I'm here, really, and I'm a bit overexcited seeing you all. So sorry about that. I'm calming myself down now. Yes, I'm going to go actually start at the point where I was tasked with writing this book, which was in the ICU in South Africa when Dad had just come out of his coma. And he was saying some fairly loopy things, but he also said some very straightforward things, one of which was, please find a way to make Mum's book happen. So that was in the back of my mind. And then we were tidying out her study, and there was this binder. And it had a lot of her thoughts and kind of distilled the key things that she wanted to say. While I had the start there, it was all her writing was basically handwritten. So once I had transcribed that, it was about 5,000 words, and this is 60,000 in this book here. So it was a start. And I knew that her heart was to write about community, hospitality, food, and in the context of the Arosha story. So I then set about transcribing everything I could find that fitted into those themes with newsletters and her journals. And once I transcribed it, then it was a question of how to shape it and how to make it into a book. So what I've ended up doing is not what she exactly planned, but it does capture the main things she wanted to talk about, I think. And it's structured around a meal, both taken in the literal sense, but also taking the kind of stages in a metaphorical way as well, symbolic way. So you begin with hunger. I think all good meals require hunger. And then it goes on to preparation, the welcome, the table itself and the meal, the clean-up, and the forever feast. Because I've thought a lot about heaven since she died, and a lot of the way heaven is spoken about is around food and eating and feasting and banqueting. So, yeah.
Jill, excellent. Thank you. That's a great beginning. Now we can anticipate what the book, how it's kind of structured and how you put that material together. I know from what you've said that it includes a variety of genre. So your mom's journals, you've written some Bible stories, there's some prayers in it and things like that. Can you tell us a bit more about the variety of materials and how you wove it together?
Yes, so you've got the kind of non-fiction Christian standard content, and that's divided between my mum and I, and we've got different fonts. But what I discovered in her writing was some of the most vivid and colourful writing was actually accounts of her life and how this looked played out. So there was the theory, but her accounts of how it all looked as she lived it in the various contexts of Arosha around the world set all the theory alight. And so I wanted to keep that kind of immediacy of a journal. So interspersed between the sections is a chronological accounts that begin from the day we arrived in Portugal in 1983, and it concludes about 2 days before she died, because, sorry if you didn't, we were able to pull her journal out of the water and dry it off. And it's a really beautiful, it was really beautiful to find what she was thinking about and writing about and what God was speaking to her about it right at that point. So, yeah, it's that's there. And then the biblical piece, once you start looking, there's so much food in the Bible, but I didn't want to preach about that. I wanted people to be able to feel like they had been at some of those meals. And so I just tried to get inside them and walk through them using as much of the detail that's actually there, which is a lot, but pull you in so that you feel like you're at the meal and imaginatively can see maybe why Jesus, and the Old Testament's a lot of food as well. Yeah.
Joe, I really look forward to reading all those bits. Have you got something you could read to us right now?
I'm 44 and I need several pairs of glasses. Okay. So this is right from the beginning of the book, and it's me speaking here. It is I, not the Lord. Okay. Let's begin with a bold idea. Might hospitality be as close to the heart of a lived Christian faith as church-going, financial giving, or Bible reading? There is something irrefutably uncompromising in these words from Paul to the young church in Rome, as direct as any of his exhortations and as clear. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. That's Romans 12:12-13. But while hospitality was woven into the cultural fabric of his first century Mediterranean audience, and remains so in much of the global south, for many of us in materially comfortable, individualistic 21st century settings, it is a lost art. It's a practice we've forgotten, neglected, or distorted beyond all recognition, so some reassurance might be welcome. To be hospitable, you do not need to know how to make squares of fabric into elaborate shapes. You do not need to have mastered French, Italian, Indian, or indeed any country's cuisine. You do not need to have unchipped glasses and matching plates, silver cutlery, and specific knives for fish, butter, and cheese. You do not need to have a stock of witty anecdotes or a dust-free home. You can, in fact, be hospitable without a home. Among the classiest hospitality I have ever received was in an ancient camper van in Italy. Thank you, Lena. I have also shared a packed lunch with a neighbouring car in log-jam traffic, been offered coffee in a bus shelter, and been wrapped in the tenderest care by a homeless teen as I cried under a tree in a city park. Hospitality at its heart is just that, the offer of kindness and care and a place to belong for a while.
Joe, thank you. We look forward to hearing a bit more. Peter, I'd like to turn to you now. The proceeds from the book will go to Arasha. And for those of us who may be new to Arasha, can you tell us more about what Arasha is? Just explain the vision and what it is that Arasha does.
Sure. I have to say hello as well because it's really wonderful to be back in this place. We were technically out of a home for nearly 2 years, and Regent was one of our homes, and we referred to it as our community of the journey. So we owe a huge, great debt of gratitude to this place and to you all for turning out on a winter night. So I've always been in trouble with the Arasha communications people, and now Joe is one of them, even more trouble. But I used to say when people said, "What's Arasha? Come and live with us for a year and you'll understand it." And they said it wasn't a very practical way of explaining. However, it is still a good way to go about it. Essentially, the heart of the problem was that at the time we began in the early 80s, none of my environmental or conservation friends really darkened the door of a church, and many of them had already come to believe that the Christian narrative was really the big problem for the environmental movement in a number of ways, because there were wild Christian remarks about Jesus coming back and it was all going to burn and why did it matter, and a general quietism about social issues, let alone environmental issues. And when I was out and about in Christian circles, candidly, I never really heard much about what any Christian good news would mean for anybody apart from their personal life, let alone, in those days, social structures, let alone the creational implications of this good news. And in response to that, long story short, we did persuade an Anglican missions group to second us to this new organization that they were quite clear we would have to start, which well, because it involved buying a farmhouse in Portugal, and they didn't do that kind of thing. And fair enough. And now, having done it, I can see why they didn't do that kind of But anyway, so we teamed up with a zoologist and his family, and we didn't want to write stuff, and we didn't want to campaign. We wanted to know in practice what it would mean if we were going to care for a particular bit of creation. And we did live on a really quite small headland for 12 years and not really go anywhere, trying to figure that out. And part of the figuring was done in the break between that first centre, which was handed over to Portuguese leadership, which was always the plan, and what was going to follow. And Regent and Lauren and Mary Ruth in particular, but many others, helped us to kind of crystallize what we'd lived but not had really time to reflect on in the hurly-burly. We reckoned probably 2,000 people actually lived with us over those 10 years. So we were deeply involved in hospitality in that way. And it doesn't give you much time for reflection. But if A Rocha was going to be more than a bird observatory in Portugal, then everybody needed to figure out, everybody involved at that point needed to figure out what it was. And it distilled into a determination never to tell people locally what to do, because we didn't know, but to cohere around 5 commitments: that we were Christian, and we were quite clear, actually, about the kind of stream of Christian belief which we were in. And one of the most vivid expressions of that would always be Regent now, and we've sent quite a few people here, that we were Christian, that conservation was our core business, because the environmental agenda is very wide, and there were an enormous number of issues we were being pressed to engage with, but really we only knew about conservation. That was our core business, and the lens through which we saw a lot of things. Then community was deeply important to us, partly understanding the Christian bit and the conservation bit, that relationship is at the heart of both things. And the lack of relationship in the conservation agenda, often being driven by the money dynamic of grants, has made many projects around the world fail and be ineffective. If you come in and out on the boom and bust of a grant, you're simply not there long enough to make any difference, because it's people that really affect the places around them. And people, particularly in rural areas, do not move fast. And so we've been embedded and long-term and deeply engaged in community. And then we were very diverse culturally. We kept this Portuguese name that people have struggled with, A Rocha, the rock, just to make that point. And I was going to say inflicted it on all the A Rocha people around the world. There are some who maybe feel that. But we are a culturally very diverse and wonderful family. And that's been something we've celebrated all the way through. And it's been a very important way of us understanding that God works in different ways with different people and in very different insights, and it's been a very rich thing. And finally, we cooperate very, very widely. I think the term you've now... They now collaborate. It's great to sit next to the comms people. But anyway, we were cooperating, but now we collaborate, but it's the same thing. Anyway, but the point is that this is an important theological point, which I think some of the Regent people will get. If you have a truncated version of the good news, if you start with, are you one of us or one of them? Are you one of the saved people or not? You're not in the same psychological community with people. You're already talking over a wall. And if you end with, where am I going when this life is done, a similar kind of division will end up. But rather, if you start biblically with the community of creation, which is a community in biblical terms, which extends to all living things. Look at that first covenant in Genesis chapter 9, where 7 times it's the covenant I am making with all of life. And it's specified, all living creatures, all of life. That automatically means that you have a long common journey with all comers. And we have some very surprising partners around the world on the ground and in the field work, because we share a lot. And it pains me to say that often psychologically what we find we're sharing more with people who would not call themselves formally Christians. And those who have Christian labels often have absorbed so much from the culture around that the DNA has got so warped, it's like a genetically modified gospel, that we don't have so much in common with our supposed fellow believers. It's a strange thing, but it leads us into all sorts of fruitful cooperations and collaborations around the world. So 5 commitments: Christian conservation, community, cross-cultural or cultural diversity, and collaboration. And we've kind of gathered around that. And because we're now nearly at the end of the book tour, I've gathered that a case study would help people to see what I'm talking about. So let me give one from Kenya that perhaps will explain. So the problem we were faced with on the ground in Kenya is that the coastal forest, which extended from Mozambique in the south up to Somalia in the north, so something like 4,000 kilometers, is now essentially down to 40 kilometers. That's all that's really left. And of course, this raises huge flags for conservation people because there are unique species in there, and it's a tremendously important site for global biodiversity. And millions of dollars of aid money had gone into stopping people from chopping down the forest. But by a long-term presence there, our Kenyan brothers and sisters found out that the reason people were selling it for carvings to tourists and charcoal was to pay school fees. And so essentially what we did was made the forest the banker for the school fees by anybody who visited it. All the fees paid school fees, and all the students from the forest-adjacent communities who were paid for were part of the commitment, was a commitment to the forest for the future of the communities there. And that forest, the Arabuko-Sokoke forest, is still there. It's still intact. We're buying up now huge blocks of a remnant area further north, the Dakacha woodland. But you see that coming from the outside, you would never have figured out what was the problem and how to fix it. It was Giriama communities locally, many of whom were Muslim, who have given us the most, when I've visited, the most moving and personal welcome, because some of their kids are now university graduates through the forest. That's where the wisdom has come from. And I hope that sort of fleshes out how some of those commitments have worked out in practice in just one of the hundreds and hundreds of sites now around the world where Arosh is working. And I think it's quite wonderful that you can see from space what Christians have done for creation in those terms. My operations colleagues who like numbers tell me it's over 1 million acres now that are different. And in Portugal, we've seen that with the destruction of the southern coast of Portugal and the remaining Alvor estuary, where we've been for nearly 40 years now, remaining as a functional ecosystem, remaining still serving the local communities for all of that they do in shellfish and a whole bunch of other things, to the point where Portuguese journalists always say this is a miracle when they see it. And it's because Christians have been there and not gone away. And that's really the heart of the thing. Sorry if that's a bit long, but
No.
you know, that's 38 years in 8 minutes, so you can.
40
Peter,
next
it's
year.
exactly what we wanted to hear. I have another question for you, though.
You're going to make an enemy of my daughter.
No,
Keep
it's
you-
okay. Joe's got a turn coming.
Oh, yeah, fine.
I'd love it if you could tell us a bit. We saw those lovely and moving pictures of Miranda serving others and all the rest of it. Can you share a bit about the early days and Miranda's role in Arusha and how hospitality was foundational for the initial stages of your work?
Yeah. I want to start with a footnote, actually, and perhaps an encouragement to everybody here to reflect on hospitality as a metaphor, in the sense that there's a way in which I feel I'm being hospitable to you in talking about Miranda. I don't want to privatize the experience, but neither do I want to emote. I'm British, after all. And it was a decision to talk publicly about her, but I feel that if one thinks through the lens of hospitality, it's right to welcome others to that. So here we go. And I haven't done this much, but 3 years is a distance enough to do it, I think. Before we were married, we had both been influenced by Francis Schaeffer and other people like that. Miranda had effectively become a Christian at college where we met. And she was saying to me before we were married that the verse, show hospitality to one another, was going to apply for her in marriage. And we immediately I was teaching in a boarding school with kids who came from often difficult backgrounds. And essentially, right from the beginning, the home was open. And she had that very, a very open a way of understanding people's pain and of making them feel extremely understood and welcomed. And those around Regent, getting from A to B in this place was a nightmare because she seemed to have connected with so many people. So I learned our time budgets had to be given a generous amount before and after because nobody really wanted to talk to me, but they certainly wanted a flash of those blue eyes and her understanding of whatever they were going through, which she felt very deeply. And so essentially, also we belonged to a time when words were becoming cheap and Christian affirmations were losing their value. And we did feel, particularly because Christians had been absent from the formation of the contemporary environmental movement, that we would be doing best by allowing people to walk into our space and actually discover for themselves what it was like and whether it was worth anything, rather than the things we were going to just talk about. And that was just a commitment. And we did have to learn how to do it over a certain period of time. It doesn't always come naturally because we're all inconvenient people in our own ways. And some of the Arosha visitors, being fanatics for counting insects or birds, could have their extreme moments. The fridge, you could open it and there would be a snake in there to slow it down for the people who wanted to photograph it. And I remember a white stork occupying a great space in the freezer for a long time because somebody was eventually going to get round to stuffing it, but they never really did. And these kind of things. So I think that we had to learn where the boundaries were. We had a door to our own apartment, which was upstairs, and it did shut. And as these girls got into their teen years and prettier, the door was shut more often by me because the students were finding their way up a bit too often. But I think that all the same, it was something that was at the heart of Arosha from the beginning, and that was down to Miranda, who was a great cook and who worked very well with our wonderful colleague Violinda in Portugal. And I think we also theologically came to understand that the fundamental artifact of the Christian faith was the table and not a business meeting. And it wasn't about business metrics. It was about deep relational commitments made through pain and made through an unconditional welcoming that reflected Jesus' welcome. So I think this book does give you, because a lot of it is drawn from Miranda's journals, it does give you a flavor of her fierce, she was Irish, her fierce passions about these kind of things and her struggles with it as well, because everybody has their off days. And if you're living in community, people don't notice that and go away. They're still there. So I think it's an honest account. We've always wanted to tell a true story. And I hope it will allow people within their own ways of being to consider a posture of hospitality.
Great, Peter, thank you. Back to Joe. So we're beginning to understand, Joe, that this book and your mother's story are rooted in the work of Arosha. So my question to you is, what role did Arosha play in your life?
Quite a big role. So I was 5 when Arosha was founded, and I tried to explain Arosha from that point on to greater or lesser success. I remember thinking Portugal wasn't dramatic enough, so I told my little friends I was going to live in Iberia. What role did Arosha play? I think in some ways Arosha felt like an extension of our family at first, so I felt quite possessive of it. I had the struggles of the eldest as of absorbing some of the financial stresses. I remember telling my siblings not to ask for ice creams and things like that because I knew that we were dependent on people's generosity, which was great towards us, but yeah, just wanting us to, as children, not to sap people's money, and that was in my mind as a child. We lived it as a family. It was our life and our background and our context.
Okay, this might just cause you to elaborate on that a bit more. So your childhood home was this field study center with all sorts of people coming and going. What were the benefits of having so many people around, and what were the costs?
Oh, good question. So I'm quite extroverted. So for me, always having company. So you could always find someone to persuade not to do their field studies or their data entry or the washing up, to do a water fight or reel them into one of my projects. I always had projects and they always needed a lot of helpers. So I was good at that. I could get some people to help me with my maths homework or do it for me in an ideal world. I absolutely loved the variety of people, and I learned a huge amount from having older Christians around who were living their faith in a variety of different traditions and expressions. They made me see a few steps ahead what that could look like, and the people, by and large, who came were very kind to us children and didn't make us feel in the way. They made us feel part of it. We'd get taken along on various expeditions, and we could be involved in any of the activities going on that looked interesting to us. In terms of the cost, the goodbyes were really hard. I remember the first person I really attached to who left, realising, looking at my mum's journals, that she was only actually there for 2 months. She was called Fee, and she came to live with us while my youngest sister was born. And I was absolutely devastated when she left. I thought I'd never stop crying. And Mum did me this picture on a card of a train leaving the station and another train arriving, who was Lizzie, coming to take care of us, who I didn't forgive for a long time for not being Fee. And how, it, in life you have goodbyes and they're hard, but then you have hellos and they're better. And the goodbyes just remained quite difficult for me because I did bond with, any old person coming through, however long or short they were there. I didn't enjoy that part. Probably the goodbyes did outweigh that. There was also something about being under scrutiny. I felt like people did watch our family, and sometimes they would say that was the most profound thing about being at Arosha, and which is not really. It's quite a heavy thing to bear, knowing that you're going to miss. I don't know. There was a sort of a degree of pressure to behave quite well. I also remember it didn't do much, but it felt there was an expectation, even if we didn't meet it. Actually, so the next people who took over the centre, I think they had really good tight rein on their kids, and I took my daughter back there, and so Martial was, this last summer, she was a volunteer, and he was telling her a few little stories, and then he sort of rolled his eyes and said, basically, they were quite wild. Anyway, yeah, I think we probably were a little bit. I remember Mum talking, so Mum used to get her hair cut every little while, so because it was only now and then, she'd get her bangs cut really, really short, and then they would grow out to a normal level. But I remember her coming back feeling really exposed from the hairdresser and then having to walk the gauntlet of about 10 opinions. So do you remember? Oh, yeah, so there was something about a bit goldfishy about living with all the people. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe. We're going to just move on here. The subtitle of the book, A Place at the Table, is Faith, Hope, and Hospitality. Peter, could you comment on the connection of the Christian hope and faith to creation care?
Yeah. There is a lot, of course, to be said about this, and we live in the age of miracles, and so I think Lauren Wilkinson's book may appear, and that is going to have some very profound things to say about hope and creation. But essentially, how you see the world around you, and in fact how we treat the world around us, depends a lot on what we believe. When we look at a landscape, it's belief written in material. And sadly, we mostly come from Western societies that think that the more money we have, the happier we're going to be. And if you look at the logic of the landscape, it reflects that economic priority. And I think we forget the material form that ideas take. And in particular, this relates to the question of hope. Because if what we look around us at is simply the consequences of human behavior, knowing the human heart, most of my environmental friends would say there is rather little hope. And that is because, as you know, in the lifetime of a Rocha, we've lost over half of life on Earth. We've seen dramatic climate change. Thank you to my dear friends from Alaska who have come to be with us tonight, but they should be sitting here and telling us about the impact of climate change. And certainly my brothers and sisters in Africa who live an unmediated relationship to their food supply and to the soil and the air and the water will tell you that climate change is a tremendous global crisis now. In objective terms, it's not surprising that many of my friends in conservation groups and environmental groups around the world really see little hope, because they see what people are doing and they think it's down to people to sort it out if they're not believers, and therefore they're not really feeling very positive about the prospects. And I'm afraid that I don't really know of any way to feel hopeful about the world around us without first understanding that it is what the Psalms call the fingerwork of a loving God, and that changes everything. It changes everything because it automatically builds in a purpose to creation, which we as Christians understand to praise God. That's creation's purpose. It's not actually there just to meet our needs. It's there as an epiphany, it's there as a choir, it's there to reveal the glory of God. And that's in its very nature. And that isn't going to change no matter how deep the crises that people visit on creation are. So I think the first thing is, what are we talking about when we talk about nature or the world around us? We're talking about God's fingerwork, his loving and cared world. And just as he offers the same future to us as deeply broken and flawed and even dying people, he offers the hope of the new renewed creation, the new life of this coming kingdom of God. So that offer is not withdrawn for the world around us. In theological terms, it's what Richard Bauckham refers to as ultimate hope. And increasingly, for me personally, as we face in A Rocha so many dramatic and dire situations around the world, the proximate hope, which I talked about at the beginning, namely that because Christians have been there, millions of acres are different, wetlands are still there, habitats get restored, urban communities get some green space, you could go on and on. These are signs of the kingdom of God, and their hope near to us, their hope in front of us. But increasingly, and maybe it's because I'm older and some of the things that have happened, ultimate hope is what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's really a Christocentric thing, that it's Christ's creation, and it's not my responsibility to save it. One of our fundraising problems, I have our wonderful fundraising director here. Your job title is probably different. Sorry about that. But anyway, you know what I mean. Many environmental organizations pitch it by saying, give us your money and we'll save the world for you, one way or another. We've never said that. The world has a savior, and it's not a Russia. And the delivery vehicle, actually, for what we believe in a Russia is not a Russia. It's the global church, understanding that the good news extends to everything. And as they are primarily present where all the biodiversity hotspots are, that's a very strategic and savvy way to go about it. And that's why there's more resonance for what a Russia does often in secular conservation groups than there is amongst our Christian brothers and sisters. Because the conservation people understand that without people in the global south, most of whom are Christians, you can't deliver your mission. So, answering your question, really, we're in front of quite radically different views of what the world is, which is why you can't really borrow the secular environmental narrative and add Jesus on the end and say it's a Christian view of the environment. It's a fundamental view that everything is different because the world has a loving creator who will not abandon his creation, and nor does he abandon us in our tribulations, either personal or environmental. And that's, for me, where the hope resides. Hope and comfort are different things. And we could talk about that for a long time. This is the kind of cold scaffolding I've given you. It's not what you do to find comfort in a groaning creation, as Roman calls it. For that, for me, it's Bach and skylarks on Salisbury Plain, and if necessary, chocolate ice cream.
We're going to focus a bit more on the faith, hope, and hospitality. So we've talked about some of the problems, and certainly one of the problems in our world is that it's a post-pandemic world where people lived in isolation and that there has been a significant breakdown in community and that kind of thing. How does a place at the table speak to those looking for ways to reconnect, Joe, and regain their sense of belonging and hospitality?
Yeah, I think we all thought that we'd come bursting out of our little Zoom rooms and find each other and know what to do. And I don't know about your context, but in mine, we're still struggling to find our way back. There's still this residual, almost fear of each other. Layered upon that is what we're calling the cost of living crisis in the UK. Some people who were doing absolutely fine are having the choice between heating and eating this winter. And that in itself has another challenge because people are pulling up the drawbridge and spending their finite resources on themselves. And what I really hope that the book will give an encouragement to us is the reminder that our identity as Christians is people of hospitality, people who know how to live together sacrificially, who know how to have those to share with those without, to draw closer together in hardship, even than we were in plenty. I think there's been a conflation of hospitality with entertaining, and entertaining perhaps is harder to do in any circumstance, and it's not for everybody. I think hospitality is for everybody, and we need it now more than ever. There's some horrific stats on loneliness, among them that the impact of loneliness on a lifespan is more severe than smoking and heart disease. It really cuts deep psychologically and physically and spiritually. And Christians have a built-in answer to this. We're a community. We're a community who echoes a God who's a community. The Trinity is a dynamic relationship into which we're invited and into which we have a place. And not only that, but God asks us to be the host to him. He's often in the Bible the host, he's often the guest, and sometimes the food. So in God's image, we're a people who should be open. And Jesus said in the Last Supper that is how people would know him, what he was like, and that is how they would be drawn to him, through the love that we show to each other and extend outwards. And this is a moment for us to do that in a way that will be noticed, because other people need it desperately and don't know how to give or receive it.
When you talk of hospitality, it's clearly that extension to others, that gracious extension and inclusion of others. We're not just talking about setting a table and inviting people to tea or something like that. Peter, do you have anything else to add to what you mean by hospitality? Add to anything else that Joe has said about Christian hospitality?
I don't, but I think, except to say that I think in my Christian tradition, guilt has often been the way to get people out of their seats and doing something. And I think that there's no future in that. And we are all different. And this isn't just a new topic to feel guilty about. I think it should be invitational, and everybody's going to learn their own way of doing it. And furthermore, as you know, the biblical grammar in English is often reduced to a word, you, that we hear, me personally, I. And I think this is the people of God. And this is how the people of God should live instinctively within their own personalities and constraints. And within the Arosha teams and communities, we've sometimes had profound introverts who've made a very important place of quiet for those who are struggling, whereas the extroverts can be very difficult for people to be with. So it's not a personality type. And, well, you know, sorry. Yeah. And I think that... So I want this, I yearn for this book really to, as some books of prayer have done for me in the past, for people to say, do you know, I've done more praying than I thought I did. And I think this book may help people to say, perhaps I'm a bit more hospitable than I thought I was. And maybe it is just eye contact at a bus station. Or it's not some grand gesture. Goodness, Miranda did all the cooking and I'm useless. And I've discovered in trying to offer hospitality now on my own, just how unbelievably difficult it is, and how I'm not really cut out for that. So I'm doing hospitality in a very different way now than when Miranda was doing it with me. But I hope that, just to say that I hope this book and Joe's insights will take away a layer of guilt, not least through the humor that you always have and the retelling of those biblical stories, but be an encouragement to us all to discover our calling within the people of God's love for the world.
Great. Joe, do you have, I think we have a bit of time. Do you have a small section you can read to us? And then you might want to be preparing a question or a comment. As you see, as usual, we have 2 mics here in the chapel, and you'd be welcome to address a question to either Joe or Peter. So we'll hear from Joe, and then if you would like to ask a question, please go to the mic. And we'll take about 10 minutes for questions if there's time for that. Thank you.
I'd just like to start with the fact that Dad has mastered the Portuguese fish stew, so it's not entirely true. And there's always the Darling Deli with the chicken pie, so if all else fails. Okay, so I'm going to read from a bit of my mum's diaries, starting with the 31st of May in 1994. We have had a lot of visitors in a seamless succession of arrivals and departures. It is sometimes a little dizzying and always interesting, stimulating and challenging. My greatest worry is that of running out of personal resources in terms of genuine welcoming love and the capacity to be involved in double listening. What is this person saying, and what is God wanting to say to this person? We depend very heavily on the Lord for energy and strength to keep going out to people, to keep being available to look after them properly, and to find the best ways of involving each one in what is going on. Smaller children always love to fly the birds after they've been banded. Bigger visitors enjoy that too. Being so closely involved with the raw material of creation is always a profoundly moving experience and often a source of healing too. 28th of August, 1994. Yesterday, a group of Portuguese people from the north arrived at 9 a.m., having travelled overnight, and the outgoing people were still asleep. 12 of us had slept out on the beach that night to watch some especially good shooting stars and overtook the arriving group in the lane on our way home. It was a question of taking a deep breath, making strong coffee, and setting to making beds, shifting rucksacks, cleaning bathrooms, and so on. There has been yet another setback in the saga of a reserve on the Alvor estuary. Despite the recent encouragements as the process to create the protected area goes forward, there have been signs that the developers and the local council are trying to create loopholes in the law in order to allow construction of a marina and major tourist infrastructure. A Rocha has been busy campaigning against what would be the irreversible destruction of vital habitat on and around the estuary. We are praying that environmental good sense will prevail over the ancient desire for a quick buck, and for all the team in the often discouraging moments during the campaign. 4th of September, 1994. Life lately has been hectic, as usual, but we are becoming familiar with the Krasinia juggling act. Constantly changing households of students and visitors of various nationalities, lots of day visitors, a full ringing program, renewed pressure from developers, plumbing problems, and unexpected arrivals. 2 puppies, a guinea pig, and a hoopoe with a badly broken wing, all on the same day recently. Sometimes, as I've sat down to lunch under the rubber tree with 20 or so others, I've been tempted to contemplate the relative attractions of a slightly smaller family. But no, it's a brilliant life, and what a privilege to be doing this, and how exciting to watch God at work in little and sometimes bigger ways.
Wow. That certainly gives you a flavor of who Miranda is. That was a perfect section to end on, Joe. Now, if anybody would like to interact with them, I see Rosie. Are you coming up to ask a question?
I am.
Yep, you're good.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to reading the book. I wanted to share a little story of hospitality that happened to me a couple of days ago, which is an example of you don't need to have a house and you don't need to have grand abilities to cook or anything. I went to visit a dear old centenarian friend of many of us here at Regent, Jim Houston, who lives in a nursing home. And he and his wife had years and years of offering hospitality in their home. And here he is in this single room in a nursing home, and yet he offered me hospitality. When I came, he said, "Do you want a cup of tea?" And I know that it's important to accept hospitality from someone who offers it, and that's something I might ask you to talk a bit about after. That's my question. But I thought, how can he offer me a cup of tea? But all right, sure, I'd love a cup of tea. And he said, go ask the staff and they'll make one. And then he said, and have them bring me a cup of apple juice too. So I went out and found a staff person and said, can you make a cup, Jim Houston would like a cup of apple juice. Can you pour that? And he also wants to offer me a cup of tea. So they did that. They got that started. And when I came back into the room, he had laid out 2 pieces of Kleenex on his little rolling table with a shortbread cookie on each one for each of us. And that was him offering hospitality in his nursing home. So can you talk a bit about accepting hospitality and the importance of accepting it even from people who don't seem to have much to offer in that regard?
Yeah, I think there's something easier sometimes for us to be in the position of the giver and the provider, and it's allowing dignity, and it's good for people to offer hospitality. One thing that comes to mind for me immediately when you ask about that is when I was 11, we were brought to Malawi to visit good friends of our family. And the guy was a general practitioner, and he would drive around really rural villages. And he took us on one of his loops around, and we went to a village where they had maize bins that were a third of where they should be. And we were told that by the end of that calendar year, a lot of the children and elderly people probably wouldn't have made it because the supplies were not good enough. We'd had lunch before we had left, but they killed a couple of chickens for us. They provided cabbage and they provided the maize meal. And we ate it because it was their generous and beautiful gift to us. And it was a very dignified and overwhelming experience, and I will never forget it.
Yeah, I remember that day, and I remember you saying you would be back, and indeed you were. And I think it changed your life in that sense. Their hospitality did that. I think power gets into all sorts of Christian dynamics where it shouldn't be. And it gets into the hospitality thing, and it can get what somebody came up in an earlier stop on this tour in Nashville with the phrase performance hospitality, where you're kind of in a competitive situation to show. And that's why some people will feel reluctant, because they might not feel that they could respond in kind. And Rod Wilson sitting here and I have reflected deeply on how power dynamics have got into fundraising and money in the Christian community, and in a very, very unhelpful way, where those with means can unwillingly or unwittingly project a kind of impotence on those who receive. And the only thing I would say is it's very hard to receive. And we had a time, nearly 2 years, where we were between the Portuguese project and what eventually turned into, for us, to the French one, when we were required, really, we had nowhere of our own to live, nor any means, and we were offered a huge amount of hospitality all over the world. And I remember Miranda saying to me how exhausting it was to be that grateful all the time. And probably it was easier when people didn't make a great fuss of it and didn't make a great thing of it. It was easier to receive, actually. And I think we do need to remember what it's like for people who are refugees or asylum seekers who are obliged to receive, when they would be far rather giving and far rather demonstrating their abilities rather than being dependent upon the abilities of others. So I think you've said something very profound there. But it comes down to us being generous in being able to receive it. And may I thank you for being hospitable with your car to that lost British birder last Sunday, by the way. That was very good of you. That wasn't me, that was somebody I met, and Rosie welcomed him into the car. And even though it wasn't a particularly big car, and he had a lot of gear, but anyway, it made an impression on him, I think. So you know how to do it yourself.
Thank you. One more question.
Thank you. Hi, Peter. Hi. Is the mic on? Yes. Yeah, okay. I remember vividly that you, Peter, said once at the Arusha conference that Arusha doesn't, I can't remember how you put it, but you don't want to have the celebrity culture put on you. With this book, we really appreciate it. This is more than a meal, and it will be a very sumptuous meal for us to know you. Thank you so much for opening up your mom's diary and your family life to us. Now, is there a temptation or pressure to make you a celebrity? And especially after Miranda has passed away, and we think about you, and the people are watching you, and so how you are transformed, how do you change, how do you cope? How do you navigate this phase of your new phase of your life? I'm not sure whether it's too heavy a question for you, Peter.
No, I understood it, and I think it's a very sensitive question. very thoughtful, actually, and nobody's asked, in all of the events we've done, nobody's asked that question. First of all, I don't think there's any risk of celebrity. I'm taking a phrase again from Rod Wilson. What was it? We are minor celebrities in an extremely niche field of something, I don't know, whatever. So I don't think there's any risk. But having said that, it's kind of funny and kind of very sad that in Britain, it would have given Chris Naylor, who was not of a conservative political persuasion, great satisfaction that we knocked Boris Johnson off the front pages of all the press. And that was a dubious honor, but we did think afterwards that Chris would have smiled at that. But to be honest, I have not, with the help of, I was asked to do a short film about suffering with some others from a Christian retreat center, high production values, and I just had 5 minutes in it. And so for the first 2 years, if anybody wanted to know about anything, I just sent them the film link, and I have not talked publicly, and nor do I intend to talk publicly. There can be a kind of gruesome Christian, my suffering's worse than your suffering, you know, kind of thing. And obviously not going to do that. But in the honesty of my answer, I want to say to you that everybody carries their insecurities. And A Rocha has been the kind of outsider in the Christian world for a very, very long time. John Stott called us the Christian world's best kept secret. And we used to kind of glory in that. But I'm not sure it's a good thing, because I think many people are looking for what A Rocha is. And I have felt that Joe's writing and what Miranda wanted to say in the world can be carried by this book. And it's not about the number of people that it carried to, but if it's important for some people, then I'm glad about that, and glad to contribute to the process of making the book known. But we've always said that A Rocha is, I am one of many A Rocha founders. I am not the A Rocha founder. A Rocha has always been a community effort. We've structured ourselves not to have a hierarchical thing going on, and we don't. Funnily enough, one of our board members works with many global celebrities in her day job, and I wrote a paper about A Rocha and celebrity in which we said we're not going to do celebrity simply because we might have been able to do that, and it's a real decision. But if you don't think you're vulnerable to wanting to be a teeny bit famous, you haven't understood yourself. At least for me, maybe you're not tempted by that, but there is part of me that would want to have a higher profile for A Rocha than we've ever had, because as my French colleague Paul Janson says, the world needs A Rocha. And I still think that. We would like to do more of it in more places. That's a complicated answer, but you asked a really good question, and we did discuss it, didn't we, quite a lot, about how to handle this situation, and we certainly decided that instrumentalizing the accident and what happened would be kind of appalling to do that. So we've kind of never done it, and we've been quite firm about that in turning away journalists and, you know, refusing to talk about it and all of that stuff. Is that fair? You're my accountability. Is that okay? Okay then. Imprimatur from Joe Swinney.
We did say that we would end around this time. Thank you for your questions and comments. And Peter and Joe, thank you so much for the time that you've taken with us and the things that you've shared. We're all excited to read the book, and I know that we will be inspired and challenged as we do so. So from all of us tonight, we want to say thank you.
I want to thank you all, and many here from the community of A Rocha who've turned out, and many who've turned out on spec. I want to thank Thina Ayres, who's been a lifelong friend of all of this and so carefully prepared all of this. And thank you so much for what you did. And I've just thought of a thing on celebrity. John Stott always taught me that flattery is like smoking. It's great if you don't inhale.
I just want to say that just before, now is the time. Like, we saw this evening as a whole, and the idea was to invite you then to places at the tables which are out there. So there will be lovely refreshments in the atrium right out here. And please help yourself, have a little snack before bedtime. The other thing is that many people from our local Arusha are here. And I see several, as well as Arusha International. And they told me that they would wear badges or lanyards or something like that. And there is an Arusha table right outside by the elevator shaft. Right there is the Arusha table, and those people will gather, and they would love to share with you about their work and chat with you and all those good kinds of things. Jo has just exited, and that's because she's going into the bookstore, and we, of course, would love it if you would want to buy the book or order it in the future. We may not have enough copies. But I myself am thinking about Christmas presents, so you might want to do that too. And finally, to all of you online, I'm not sure where these people are, but I believe they are there someplace in cyberspace. Thank you for your being with us. And whether you've been online or in person, we want to say thank you for coming and discovering more about a place at the table. Thank you.